Şimdi ben Ayşe'den sana okey vereceğim, biz gideceğiz.
Yes, I guess we can start. Dear all, welcome to the first session of the afternoon part. First, I would like to thank you very much for being here with us. And in this session, we will listen to Professor Stavros Stavridis. He will talk about rethinking housing as common. And before giving the floor to him, I would like to introduce Professor Stavridis briefly. And I need to say that it will be an honor for me. Stavros Stavridis, architect and activist, is professor at the School of Architecture at National Technical University of Athens, where he teaches graduate courses on housing design and urban design, as well as postgraduate course on the meaning of metropolitan experience. He is currently the head of lab for the architectural design and communication, and also he is a director of the postgraduate program at his university, named as Research in Architecture, Architectural Design, Space and Culture. He has done extensive research field works in Brazil, Uruguay, Argentina, and Mexico, focused on housing as commons and on urban struggles for self-management. Research topics include urban commons, urban struggles, the social experience of metropolitan space, housing, spatial theory, architectural design, and planning. He has got numerous publications as well as articles on spatial theory and urban commoning culture. His recent publications include Common Space of Urban Emancipation, Common Space, the City as Commons, and Towards the City of Thresholds, Suspended Space of Authority, and From the City as Screen to the City as Stage. He has lectured in European and North and South American universities on urban struggles and practices of urban commoning. After this brief introduction, I would like to leave the floor Professor Stavridis, and thank you very much him for accepting our invitation and joining us. So I would like to invite the professor. Thank you very much. Floor is yours.
So thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be with you, and I really enjoy this invitation. I imagine this is a beautiful conference. I'm afraid that I can follow only the sessions on English language, but I know that from the description of the contents, it's really a challenge for thought, a food for thought, and also a challenge for rethinking our role in the production of space, and especially on housing. My special thanks to everybody who has done this invitation, and especially the school and the university which is hosting this meeting. So my attempt will be to somehow discuss with you the issue of housing using the lens of commons. As you know, this is widely used literature which is developing in various parts of the world, with lots of inside conflicts, of course, as every kind of international discussion. But I think it can enrich our approach to the issue of housing, and especially I think it can enrich our approach to the questions about housing. What is housing? For whom? How is it produced? And how can it be produced in alternative ways? One small note, I try to refer to examples that I have been able to experience, either as part of the movement or as somebody who has been there, or seen the actors, discussed with the actors, and learned from their practices. Because I think it's important for the production of theory to be aware that theory is not simply produced by us academics or by intellectuals in general who somehow stay in a kind of distance from real action. I think theory is also produced by people who are involved, engaged, sometimes risk their well-being or their lives in order to be able to support some things they believe in. And so I deeply respect the way those people actually produce not only experiences, but theory, because they also do reflect upon what they're doing. They are not simply, engaged in experiences without even thinking about the results or the consequences. So I'm grateful for being able to get into contact with people from various movements related to housing, especially in Latin America, in which continent I have focused my research. So most of all the examples that I use today will come from this continent, not out of a kind of exotic research for something which is spicier and different, but really because I think this is the continent in which today interesting thoughts about housing as commons are being produced, both in terms of practice and in terms of theory. It seems that I cannot change the image.
No.
Okay. So I should use the cursor. Sorry?
That's the next one. Yeah.
Thank you so much. So first of all, let us talk about the common and the commoning practices. I think it's important, first of all, to understand that we are talking not about a situation which is established once and for all. That is a situation of sharing under specific conditions. We are talking about practices, forms of doing things. And I think these practices can be described better with a verb like commoning, which is of course a new verb. It didn't exist before. It's actually the practice, the action of doing things towards establishing a common ground, towards maintaining this common ground through specific rules. And I think those actions are not simply actions of distribution. We are used to talk about sharing as a form of distribution, and we are used to talk about sharing as an equal sharing, a just sharing, as a way of ensuring that distribution is just. I think commoning is more than that. I believe that commoning is the process through which sharing becomes a way of shaping ways of living, common life, forms through which you share not simply goods, something which is outside, describable as an entity, but also habits, ways of being together. So I think this is why sharing should be linked to practices of caring, to practices of getting into relations with others, to practices of mutuality. Having this in mind, can we use the idea of commoning to somehow reformulate the housing question? First of all, I think by thinking housing as a practice of commoning, we, from the beginning, distance ourselves from the idea that house is the realm of privacy, of the private, and therefore of the private ownership or the ownership of a specific group of people like a family. I think from that time, from the beginning, that we introduced the idea that housing can become a place of commoning, we somehow try to understand how housing in a way involves people in creating conditions of sharing space in which co-inhabiting becomes the central issue. So, because I say this because in many cases, both in architecture and urban planning, housing is being understood as a way of producing in large numbers individual houses in order to address a specific collective need or in order to enhance already existing market relations. In my approach, in my suggestion, excuse me, of housing as commons, I put an emphasis on what unites these specific houses into housing as a condition of living together. So instead of asking how many, how arranged in order to ensure that you can have many of those houses in order to support specific needs, instead of asking this, which has in many cases been the question of housing, especially in periods of dire need for providing houses, like the housing question, you know it from the times of Engels. Instead of asking how many and for whom, it's better asking what ways can be employed in order to create through housing forms of being together. So putting an emphasis on co-inhabiting instead on putting an emphasis on housing as the providing of a good or a commodity. And there comes the second idea that I think it's important to be connected with commoning, potentiality. As you can possibly see already, there's a certain approach to the discussion about commons in my view. It's not a discussion in which everybody agrees. It's like the discussion about democracy. You can find extremely conflicting approaches to democracy. I mean, when Trump talks about democracy, I'm worried. So you know that he talks about democracy too. So it's important to distinguish your own approach, your own point of entrance to a specific discussion. What is democracy when we talk about democracy? So for me, discussing commoning is already very much connected to the discussion of potentiality, and especially the potentiality of social emancipation. There is a specific theoretician and also a researcher who has studied the Brazilian case extensively, James Holston. Probably you know him. He's an anthropologist from the States, but he's very much into the Brazilian society. He's married to a Brazilian, very important theoretician too. And he talks about the politicization of the oikos. You know that oikos is an ancient Greek word, which is not simply the space of house. It's the whole set of relations which is inside the house, like more or less near to the idea of household in English. So the politicization of oikos in Holston is exactly the process in which the demand for housing is not simply a demand for a good. It's a demand for inclusion. It's a demand for having access to the right to the city, which, as you know, for Lefebvre, is not simply the right of access to a certain good or a certain service. It's the right of access to society, to the city as a whole, to the right, to the opportunity of creating the city, not simply getting access to it, to the existing one. So I think it's important to face this process as a kind of potentiality. And potentiality means that there are some forces, there are some possibilities inherent in struggles for housing as commoning, which can lead to acts of experimenting, of experiencing alternative forms of social organization. You can imagine that if we understand housing not simply as the area, the complex, and the arrangement of apartments, but perhaps as a kind of space in which human relations of inhabitation develop, then what more appropriate as a case, as an area of experimentation could it be than housing itself for alternative forms of social organization. Because cohabiting is actually the process of creating forms of organization at the level of a certain group, which indeed participates in this process. And I think these alternative forms of social organization that emerge through practices of developing housing as common, indeed gesture towards, show the direction or the possible direction towards define both the domination of existing market relations and the domination of existing forms of social organization. For example, the historical process through which the state as a dominant form of social organization has been established. And I will try to show from the examples that I will use that this is happening. This is not a possible case. This indeed is happening in certain cases that I'm going to show you. First of all, I think it's important to see that those struggles for housing as commons indeed are not struggles in which a specific subject of struggle pre-exists and simply takes it into action. These are shaping struggles. These are struggles because what is at stake is a form of organization of living together. Subjects are being formed in the process of struggling for housing or managing, controlling, shaping rules of cohabitation. And that is why I think what is happening is actually a discussion, a deliberation, but also a process of testing through which priorities are being discussed, through which the idea of creating rules is being promoted. And of course, the question of sharing immediately faces the question of the sharing of power. So you know that a social organization is always based on a certain kind of distribution of power relations. So what if the struggles for housing as commons hint towards the direction of sharing power? That is, of sharing the power to devise the rules of cohabitation, of sharing the power of participating in the process of design, in the process of imagining, in the process of projecting needs and aspirations, and not simply, the old dogma of modernism, not simply following a kind of abstract description of the needs of the human, wherever he or she is. So I think these are forms through which we might call it popular power. I don't know what it really means. I mean, it simply means, in my approach, the possibility of developing forms of governing the specific group through practices that accept the idea of sharing as common. So through practices that accept that sharing is not simply a distribution of goods, it's not a distributive, let's say, idea, but it's essentially an idea about living together, creating the common ground, which is not taken for granted. I strongly insist that common ground is being produced at the process, through the process. Then we can go to the issue of learning from Latin America. I think there are certain reasons for that. Of course, one of them is that I have a lot of research to refer to, but this is, not a very important reason. I think that what is happening, especially in the housing movements in Latin America, is that there is not simply a more determined or more successful kind of people who are motivated because they are poor and they can manage to gain some victories and finally perhaps be able to have decent housing for themselves and for their families. It's also the fact that because Latin America was developed under the shadow of colonialism, it has integrated to the struggles elements that go beyond a specificity of Western kind of thinking. I'm not one of those who is, mesmerized by thinking about how important it is to think about the alien, the outer, the outside, the colonial other, and so on and so forth. These are important issues, but I think one important knowledge that we can get from studying Latin American movements is that things can be otherwise. Is that thinking about housing and doing things in order to establish the right to housing can happen in other ways. And as we will see, these other ways are not simply and completely different, but they have some elements that can enrich our own experiences. We will never be in the same position, perhaps. I don't know. I'm not sure about it, though, because especially in Greece, we are suffering from colonialism. Now again, because of the crisis, we became a dead colony, as some say, and so on and so forth. But let us forget for the moment this. I think what we will possibly learn from these movements is that the Western tradition related to the housing question has its limits. And these are cultural limits, these are political limits, and these are ideological limits. So let us see what at least 3 areas I suggest from which we can take some new thoughts about dealing with the problem of commoning in housing. The first area is what is called the logic of buen vivir, which is an indigenous way of thinking that comes from, especially in the Andean countries, the countries which are near this huge mountain area, but also from countries like Mexico or Argentina or Ecuador or Bolivia, which are countries that still have an alive indigenous population. I'm talking about indigenous population, not in the supporting the idea that they are there before, but simply in order to find out how they can be introducing to our discussion alternative points of view about life. So buen vivir is based on the idea of a system in which nature is integrated, of a system of living together, a system of life, whatever you want to call it, that is developing itself with the idea of finding complementarities instead of hostilities, finding common grounds instead of areas of conflict. And so buen vivir, which means living well, but obviously it's not living well in the way that consumerist culture tries to develop it. So I think we can use this logic, and they are using this logic, in order to support a total approach to life, not simply analyzing co-inhabiting, in our case, to various needs, like I need services of this kind, I need air, I need sun, I need health facilities, I need sewage, I need, okay, and thus checking each of these to see if the housing condition is decent. No, I think in their approach, buen vivir is a description of life which cannot be broken down to specific ingredients. Let us keep that as an interesting suggestion. The second suggestion is the tradition of self-management, autogestion, which is partially inherited from the cooperativist tradition that came to Latin America from in many cases from people coming as exiles from Europe, well-trained in union struggles, perhaps in many cases expelled from Europe as dangerous activists. And so they have somehow introduced to the Latin American huge amounts of worker populations this idea of self-management that comes from a cooperativist tradition. Of course, this tradition is linked to various strands of socialist or anarchist ideology. But the interesting thing is that associations in Latin America have been developing by combining this issue of community relations with the issue of union, solidarity coming from the same fate in terms of work. So the self-management is growing on the ground of cooperativism, but it's not, should not be reduced to the European or Western idea of cooperation, cooperative organization. And last but not least, there are some forms of ayuda mutua. Ayuda mutua means mutual help, which are very much alive in rural Latin America. And I'm sure there are similar traditions here in Turkey. Wherever I introduce this idea of ayuda mutua coming from Latin America, I've met people from the country saying, oh, of course, we know it, we have it. I mean, in the fields, we would always work. Today, we collect the olives of, I don't know, Stavros, and next day we collect the olives of the neighbor, because this is a kind of habit which is based on the idea that nobody can survive alone. And this is not simply out of ideology, it's out of everyday needs. So this tradition of ayuda mutua coming from rural experiences has been transposed to urban conditions, especially by the urban poor. So the areas through which informal sectors of the city have been developed, like favelas or villas miserias in Argentina, was really based on the idea of ayuda mutua. Nobody could really produce himself or herself a house for his and her own. And I'm sure you can kind of compare this with traditions that have to do with your own experiences with Jekondu, for example. So my last point in this process is learning from these areas, the lessons that I suggest. We can somehow shape the question of participation, not simply as a question in which those involved commoners, let us use the word, agree upon what they want and try to pursue it through struggle. We could break down this kind of participation in various stages, in various phases. And as we will see in the examples, this breaking down has indeed different points of emphasis depending on the movements or the initiatives. And in each case, we can learn a lot. I mean, some movements or initiatives concerning the production of housing as commons have put more emphasis on the idea of designing collectively, designing through, of course, as we will see, the participation of militant experts. Some have thought of an importance to be able to take part in the construction of the housing project as a kind of educational form, as a kind of being a process of being educated in living together. I mean, what can be more fruitful in this education than the process of learning how to collaborate? I mean, sharing work, keeping with each other's skills, capacities, and opportunities. And some other, of course, put an emphasis on the, usually most of them do that, on the preparatory work. If we are to reclaim our right to housing as a collective right, not each one's house, which is the way I described the housing question at the beginning, but as a collective right, which means as the right to create our own space of co-living. How important is the preparatory period? And we will see that in many, that is the period in which future co-inhabitants unite, shape the rules of their emerging community, shape the rules of accepting new members, shape the rules of confronting perhaps the conditions of the specific society that refuses them the right to housing, and so on. So here come the examples, which are not really examples in terms of illustrating what I said, but I think each one can contribute to the development of this process. I remember that I was allowed to use more time than agreed upon. So I take my time. If you don't mind, if you're exhausted, just express it. I can understand. So MOI is an interesting hybrid union in Buenos Aires, which combines associations of housing developed through struggle, that is, developed through demands that were successful, and associations of tenants demanding justice in terms of rents. And see their main mottos: autogestión, which means self-management; propiedad colectiva, collective ownership; and ayuda mutua. So these people are forming ways of confederation and federation that is, in the end, able to create small-scale projects of housing based on the idea that they're not simply forming an association that has a certain amount of money and then tries to develop the best solution for housing its members. No, this is the result of a struggle that has forced, as we will see, this is a common ground among the movements, that has forced specific states, specific public authorities to give them the opportunity, through collective loans mostly, to have this kind of process, to gain the opportunity to create their own housing complex by sharing all the resources, all the imaginaries that are producing new forms of living together. This is a famous project in construction, in Cooperativa La Fábrica, which is in the Buenos Aires area. And one interesting thing that we will see in other cases too is that those spaces that are usually in housing projects devoted to specific individual use, like balconies, for example, belong to each apartment. These spaces are designed in ways, because they wanted this. They are designed in ways that are creating common ground, common spaces. So spaces that can be used in a combination of cases, in a collective way of adjusting one to the needs to the other, and not simply, it might seem a minor, let's say, indication of commoning through space, but I'm sure that it shapes also conditions of living together, cohabiting. And of course, it is very important that they have managed to ensure that the production of this housing complex is based on collective ownership. This is not simple. We live in societies that do not accept collective ownership. We live in societies that the emphasis, not simply the emphasis, the absolute rule is individual ownership. So collective ownership means that this is not your apartment that you can sell, you can invite others to use or rent. No, this is an environment of living together, which is being adjusted to the needs of a certain collective, which itself has to produce the rules of inviting newcomers or dealing with differentiated needs, dealing with the history of people. So this is your apartment in terms of an imaginary distribution. In the end, this is not yours. You're just a kind of participant in a collective ownership that can change its rules through assemblies and through assembly discussions. The next example, if we can learn something from the Argentinian case, is indeed what the process of collective participation in design and management can contribute to the idea of commoning, house commoning. I think the homeless movements in Brazil may offer us some more things, not in terms of quantitatively more, but more in terms of the spectrum of the possibilities inherent in house commoning. So I've been able to study the work of Usina, Brazil, Usina is, they have a beautiful webpage you can visit. It's really very interesting because it shows all of their projects. And what is their work? The movements have managed to establish in the law governing the production of social housing in Brazil, they have managed to establish the agent called technical assistants. So technical assistants are groups of experts, including not only engineers of various kinds, but also social workers and economists and so on, so forth, which are somehow approved as able to assist housing movements in the production of their own housing spaces, provided they have managed to establish, of course, this kind of tolerance at the first period by the state or the local state, and then the acceptance of a collective loan that produces the conditions of this new settlement. So Usina is actually formed around the idea that the experts are not the ones who know. They are some kind of facilitators, some kind of helpers for the movements to understand their needs, to project their needs in ways that are important, because you need to know how to express yourself. It's not simple to see, a plan and say, oh, that is good. The assembly accepts the plan. This is a good plan. So the experts, because they are militants and they believe in their role, they have tried to devise ways in which people can be indeed involved in producing ideas, not simply in judging ideas, and also in understanding the conditions under which those ideas can be developed. For example, the first sketch is a kind of condensed description of the production of a small housing settlement out of a basic unit, which is prefabricated. So it's one of the ideas of Usina. How can we take into consideration the fact that the future co-inhabitants will work in the construction site? And because they work in the construction site, they will learn how to live together. So how can we integrate this idea to the actual structural conditions of the future settlement? One way is to use in most parts of the complex, the most easy to learn and become skilled technologies of building. So the brick could be an easy solution, provided that it's a special kind of brick that can produce load-bearing walls and so on and so forth. The brick can be an element in which unskilled people can learn how to build, contribute. They cannot learn, of course, every kind of skill that is necessary for the construction of the complex, but at least they can learn things that are important for them to be part of the construction process. And of course, they are being taught. These are seminars produced by Usina for the future inhabitants. And they are very proud, of course, in participating in them. And one example, this is a specific complex that I have visited, Copromo. It's a complex of an association that came out of a struggle for housing in the outskirts of São Paulo, one of the biggest cities in the world. So in Copromo, the discussion about the future plan actually produced different ways of understanding the shared space. First of all, at the level of a floor, the stairwell is not the typical stairwell produced by construction companies in the production of social housing in Brazil, which is limited as much as it can. It's just a machine for going up and down. No, here is a meeting place. And the stairwell is connected to a common balcony. So each house does not have its own balcony. The balcony, the public, let's say, area somehow overspills the limit of the public into the common, or entering again, perhaps the area of the shared space of a family. So this is an indication of, again, it might seem minor, but it's an indication of what kinds of space models or space suggestions can be produced through the process of participation. And they are very proud of these balconies because they somehow depict the way they understand the mixture of sharing that is related to individual apartments. And of course, a lot can be said about the outdoor space of this specific building or the specific building complex or other areas. These are some more images of the same complex. Another experiment. So the experiment of Usina and the ideas around this group of experts have to do with a renewed role of the experts. Another cooperative was formed in Rio de Janeiro, in Brazil again, which was coming not from the movement, but from the professionals being united in a cooperative of support. So a cooperative starts from the professionals, mainly architects. The one who holds the microphone is a colleague, a beautiful person who unfortunately died 2 years ago. He is of Greek origin, but all his life was spent in Rio de Janeiro, and he's very well known about his activities. He's almost considered the architect of the poor. So coming from the expert side, what it means to create a cooperative, first of all, it means sharing knowledges, sharing skills, collaboration, and not, the superficial egos of architects who know that they are the only ones who have ideas, who believe that they are the only ones who have ideas, and the advancing narcissism of the profession. I'm part of this profession, and I know it very well from inside, I can assure you. So leaving this aside means creating kind of cooperative that can indeed produce alternative suggestions to the movements again. Mutirao, which is the word that you see in the back, is exactly the Brazilian equivalent of ayuda mutua. So mutirao means that we are in support of the process of helping each other, creating this project together with a kind of catalyst presence of the united experts. This is one of their suggestions, which I think is an interesting case of complex in Rio de Janeiro. You can see that, first of all, it is inside the area of a favela, so it's a kind of urban alternative to the existing favelas, which at the same time shares some of the positive values of favela, which means that there are no individual houses. It's a kind of agglomeration, a kind of very well working together ground of living. And this is where those people take their ideas. So next case, Uruguay. Uruguay is a very small country in Latin America, squeezed between Argentina and Brazil. But on the other hand, it's a very interesting country in terms of its traditions of association movement. FUCVAM, which is the Federation of Housing Associations by Mutual Help, this is what it means, the acronym, is a very alive tradition in Uruguay. And it has been, as I managed to learn from discussions there, but also in other countries, it has been one of the most exemplary cases of associationism or cooperativismo in Latin America, because it has formed a way of fighting for vivienda popular housing. It has found a way of connecting this project with a project of demanding a more democratic and just society. That's why FUCVAM was one of the most strong struggle points in the period of dictatorship they had in Uruguay, and it managed to sustain the ability of people to struggle for justice in the middle of a very harsh and difficult situation. So FUCVAM has also supported the idea that the construction site is really an education site. It's a site of education in collective management and participation. Voting also in terms of choosing the right ways of dealing with the housing arrangement and also the rules of using the houses, and celebrating, of course. You know very well, I think we share the same cultural, if you want, background that connects the idea of sharing and perhaps commoning with the idea of collective feasts. It's an important issue. It's not simply an area of being happy and being, living outside all the difficulties of life. It's at the same time an area in which distinctive relations between people are being developed by participation. So the feast is not simply a celebration, it's also a process, a kind of ritual process, not necessarily connected to religion, but indeed to a kind of mundane religion, if I might say, which somehow relates people through their bodies and their participation and not simply through their voting in assemblies. And this is one of the complexes, especially produced for the Association of Workers in Banks. In FUCFAN, one interesting peculiarity is the fact that most of the associations are not the result of distinct housing movements, but the result of union initiatives of a certain sector that organize their members for the struggle for housing. So this is a particularity that can be interesting at the same time. And my last examples, I hope that you are not exhausted yet, come from Mexico. These are perhaps in terms of this kind of potentiality of devising social alternative forms of social organization, I think they are the most advanced in this direction, because they are in a way integrating the process of construyendo poder popular, which means constructing popular power, with the process of fighting for decent housing. These neighborhoods, which have been developed out of these struggles, call themselves autonomous neighborhoods. Let us not be misguided by the word autonomy. This is not the autonomy of self-seclusion. This is not the autonomy of gordoning off all the others outside and staying in a kind of enclosure that has the privilege, because they are very poor people, that has the privileges related to the other poor, the other urban poor. No, this is a kind of metastatic community. I use this term of metastasis. It's not a good image in the period of COVID, but if you see the wisdom of the virus, the wisdom of the virus is to go always metastasize, to go outside, whichever perimeter we try to erect in order to contain him. I don't know if he's feminine or masculine. It's a virus, and after all. But metastasis means that you always overspill any boundary that tends to include and to seclude you within a perimeter. So the metastatic communities of Mexico City are really communities that try to develop the idea of sharing space and commoning through space by building in various parts around the periphery of the city, similar kinds of neighborhoods. So this one comes from a movement which call themselves Los Panchos. Obviously, the reference is Pancho Villa, a rural rebel who is at the basis of the rural restructuring of Mexico. They do not simply work in the construction. They somehow develop the power to make this area possible for living, because they usually go to neglected spaces, brownfield spaces full of problems, like this one called La Porfolilla is at the outskirts of Mexico City, a city with 25 million people. So it's not a city, it's a monster. But at the outskirts are really, the peripheries are really the leftover places, the places with no interest for the real estate business. So they are tolerated to the first period by the local state, and then they are at least given the opportunity to use those spaces in order to create their own housing complexes. They work, first of all, in the infrastructure. In this case, this was an infrastructure that had to reclaim land from a messy area full of stay water and so on, and garbage, and industrial garbage too. And then starting to build after having indeed produced collectively the plans. We're talking about a large neighborhood in which houses are divided through the color to some kind of sub-sectors. They call them brigadas, because they are not subsectors of a neighborhood. They are at the same time representing a kind of sub-collectivity within the collectivity, which is rotating in various kinds of duties in terms of the governance of this area, which is an area in which police cannot enter. It's an area where drug trafficking cannot enter, because you can imagine that outside those areas, these are the poorest areas that you can imagine outside Mexico City. I will finish, yes. In these areas, you can imagine they are just surrounded by people, by drug trafficking people. And the second one, again, from Mexico City, another case of autonomous neighborhood. Just one more remark. You can see the names of the streets of this settlement. It's just a declaration. Justice, democracy, land, housing, dignity, education, information, independence, and Centro Comunitario. You can imagine it's a communitary center, which is in the interface with the outside community. So it's a place in which lots of people from the surrounding neighborhoods would come and ask for help, ask for support, because they have to live in a very difficult situation in neighborhoods actually governed by drug mafias. My last, let's say, suggestion, I think we can look for the potentialities of urban commoning, not simply in the aspirations, in the dreams, in the experiences, but also in the ways different kinds of space emerge, because sharing defines the rules of space making and space management. And in order to talk about the possibility of a different urban future, which obviously is a different social and political future, it is important to see how space can become not simply an area to be defined by processes of commoning, but also a shaping factor of commoning. And I think, especially by reclaiming housing as commons, we can indeed test somehow, experiment on the possibilities of sharing in an equal and supportive through mutuality society. And therefore, the meaning of public and the meaning of private is bound to change in this process. And I think this is a possibility which is emerging through real practices of real people who think that the future is not bound to the present that they live in. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor, for your outstanding presentation. It was really inspiring for us. And now maybe we can take the questions from our audience. Is there anyone who wants to say something, comment, or question? Yes, there is a person over there. Yeah. Could you? Maybe we can start. Yeah, behind.
Hello, thank you very much. start? Thank you very much for the examples.
It doesn't work. It doesn't work.
If you want to just add.
No, it doesn't work. Yes.
I may.
There is a button on off for on.
Is it on?
Yeah. Yes, maybe you can come to here. Okay.
So, thank you very much. What's really fascinating for me was the idea of going away from the commons and the European idea of ownership and the bigger subject. The first practices coming. This is the most fascinating point. And can we, this question, can we apply this methodology of research and also methodology of political action? Can we apply this to other ethical entities that we approach this? Can we apply this also to ownership, for example, or capitalism? Can we approach these as something which produce through practices, produce and maintain through practices, and also segregation of communal identities. What's really fascinating for also that people highlight the colonial approach. Why it's important for me, we expect something what otherwise must always invented. But there are some practices that are already there and reclaimed and you know this put into work. And also properties tradition as well. But I have a big question about the participation of oikos. You know, the notion of oikos.
Participation
of
oikos. Yeah.
Notion of oikos. I understand really this oikos implies hybridity of living and all the working and this all activities practice. But the idea of the notion of oikos implies for me and also this the hierarchical organization and the father of the house and the woman and the slaves, you know, this organization is a little bit problematic for me. It also think about the notion of economy comes from this notion of oikos and the government, and which is not really non-hierarchical organization of government. This is my
Yes. Do you need my convey? Or
What?
do you need my convey? Yeah. Did you hear the question? If you want, you can answer the question. Yes.
Can you use it? Are you okay?
Yeah, you can use it.
Okay. Yes, thank you so much. Most of the things that you mentioned, of course, I agree. I think that, yes, indeed, one of my aims is to show that popular creativity already exists. And it creates interesting conditions under which we can reclaim housing as commons. And this is not to say that we should adopt everything that comes from tradition, quite the opposite. But we need to be very careful in ignoring elements of tradition that have important sources of collective action, like ayuda mutua, for example, which is a very wise way of defining solidarity, not through ideology, but out of need that could then evolve to a value system, which is important. Can we indeed apply these kind of lessons or experiences to other forms of reclaiming things that are being taken from society by the ruling elites or the ruling conditions of this specific system of distribution and production. I think, yes, one interesting discussion that takes place in Latin America is that many of those movements have either evolved from union efforts or union movements, or have distanced themselves from previous experiences of activists who thought that the main issue through which society can change is the issue of work. By realizing that the issue of living together is both an area of huge suppression, so much important that it produces all the other conditions, life conditions in terms of finding job, gender conditions in terms of distribution of roles, relations to specific services like health, education, and so on. So they have somehow understood the centrality of the reclaiming of the right to housing as something that can, in a way, give the structural background for any kind of struggle which is aiming at changing society. So I think this is an important thing to bear in mind, that it can evolve to various other struggles. For example, in Tlanesi Cali, which is one of the neighborhoods, the autonomous neighborhoods in Mexico, they organized a huge support for the major strike of teachers that was happening in the city. And they managed to do that because they already had both the means, the conditions of being together without being a secluded community. They had the knowledge, the capacity, and the value system that was always opening them towards the society. So this is perhaps an important lesson. I understand your skepticism about the use of oikos. I think an explanation of the use of oikos in Holston might satisfy you. He's not talking about oikos as a condition of established roles relations within the house. He's talking about the oikos as a kind of module, as a kind of construction element of society, which can, of course, be based on different forms of relations within it. So the politicization of oikos is understanding that the social, the political struggle, the struggle for a different society does not happen outside the house. Unless it does affect the conditions of house and housing demands, it's not worthy of its name. So this is exactly in the direction that you look for, I think.
Yeah, there is another question over there.
Thank you for your very inspiring presentation. I have a question and a comment. Today we witness the spatial segregation and the parallel social segregation through partitioning of the spaces. So in cases of such as gated communities. So could you reflect on gated communities and the transformation of co-inheritance within these developments? Because we witnessed that they're defined by a lack of violence, and they seem to be quite antisocial. When it comes to my comments, I think that the cases you presented stand against housing alienation. And also refer to collective development of sense of belonging to spaces, which is very precious. And also, I wonder the mutual help that you discussed in the cases you presented. do them also involve struggle against land in addition to housing? Thank you very much.
Yes, yes, thank you so much. First of all, indeed, the issue of gated communities is an interesting issue in which we can clarify the distinct approaches to commoning. Because if you think or if you describe this as an area of commoning, provided, of course, that it is the sharing between those who are affluent or those who have the privilege of being there, then you lose the meaning of commoning, which is not the sharing of privilege, it's the sharing of potentialities in the direction of equality and solidarity. So this kind of sharing, in my approach, of course, most of the things that I've said are related to this, but I haven't dwelled on the more theoretical issue of what it means in terms of politics to support commoning as an alternative to existing society. But in my approach, I think unless you understand commoning as an expanding condition, as a condition that develops, metastasizes, includes, invites others, and especially different people, coming from different areas, from different backgrounds, but willing to create this common ground, not take it for granted, but create it, then you are bound to see cases in which commoning will evolve to its opposite, which is enclosure. The commoning of privilege, in this case, which is not the commoning actually, of privilege, in the cases of gated communities, is exactly the opposite of commoning, the way I try to describe it. It's not expanding, it's not inclusive, and it is based on the hostility towards an outside. And in most of my examples, in my case studies, I've seen that unless these kind of initiatives actively push the limits of the initial community to include others, they are bound to fail to produce something which is alternative to what exists. So I agree that, and you know that some theoreticians of commoning have chosen to call this kind of process corrupt commoning or false commoning, or quasi-commoning, commoning that presents itself as commoning, whereas it's a kind of relation between the interests based on the expulsion of others. Struggles for land, yes. Interestingly, some of the housing movements in Brazil have evolved out of movements for land, for reclaiming land from large ownerships like latifundia in Brazil, which means feudal lords, actually. So in many cases, MST, which is the movement for the rural workers without land, has reclaimed land to be cultivated, and then in the same land it has created new settlements for housing for the members of this rural area. So it's a kind of inverse garden city, as the one we were hearing before. It's a city which is attempting to bridge the gap between the rural district and the urban condition in the direction of integrating both in a new kind of social organization. But of course, this is more rare. There are elements also in Mexico in which elements of this indication in which land for cultivation is reclaimed by the Zapatista movement, but this is a large-scale example. It's an example of constructing an alternative society through the federation of small villages, which then combine to what they call juntas de buen gobierno, which means governments of good, or good governments, as they call them, because they produce an alternative example based on horizontality and rotation of duties. But you're right, that the problem of ownership and the problem of getting land from the hands of those who dominate through their presence existing lands, urban or rural, is crucial for commoning.
So I think there is another question.
afternoon. Thank you very much, Mr. Ramirez, for your thoughtful speech. Supporting this Dr. Yama from South Technical University and U.S. Secretary Program. I'll say that was my first, my advice for this is got that. Well, housing in Turkey, after recent hikes and shocks, has become probably not reach affordable for the companies such as myself. The dream has never come true for potential problem. I need to shelter myself. How can I do it without renting or buying and evading commercial rates or prices? So must I definitely own it by owning how about subsidized rental for the needy, such as myself again, like in the French, in the Asian model, housing and moderate rental system. And well, perhaps can we take this? Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for the question. Yes, indeed, there's a question about ownership as a policy for providing houses by the state to those who are unable to have houses themselves, in contradistinction to the idea of affordable or rented housing. Historically, I think making those in need as potential owners has been a kind of trap. Historically, I think this was a way of integrating them in a kind of system of relations, which makes it more difficult to resist or revolt. Workers becoming small owners, usually, historically, I mean, not necessarily, have been more pacified than workers that had to always find a new place to stay and a new place to work. This is an old argument coming actually from the discussion between Engels and Proudhon, as you probably know. But on the other hand, I think there is an alternative to that, which is being developed in some of these examples, not in the Brazilian examples, because the Constitution explicitly forbids collective ownership. But in the other cases, in Uruguay and in Argentina, there have been examples of producing a kind of collective ownership, which makes it, of course, it binds people to a certain place. But on the other hand, the relation to place is being managed collectively. So, for example, if this was the case of taking collectively a loan in order to be able to construct and produce the houses, which means debt and interest and so on, then the collective loan means that solidarity is already integrated to it. It means that if my family cannot pay its part, the other members will step in because this is a collective obligation, and they will, trust that I will then repay what they've done for me in the next case. So maybe this is an indication of a possible way out, but this way out, of course, is within the limits of this social system. We've seen cases in which the system has changed completely, at least at the beginning, in which various experiments of ownership have been developed. I'm not sure that the experiments of collective ownership guaranteed by the state were very successful, like the so-called former socialist countries. But I think that one of the most innovative cases in this direction was the Yugoslav case, in which there was a different realm of ownership between the state and the private individual, which they called social ownership. And it was the ownership of a specific collective entity of production, like a factory or a big enterprise, initially governed by the workers themselves, could have a collective ownership, could build a housing complex for its members, and those members would not have it as individual apartments, but as part of the collective ownership of this specific production unit or enterprise. This was, at the beginning, a very interesting experiment. It somehow evolved to its almost opposite, because it has made it possible, but it's another story, but just a few words about it. It has made it possible for a new managerial class to evolve, which were the heading personnel of these enterprises. So the social ownership was at the end in the hands, or not as ownership, but as a privilege of decision-making process in the hands of those people. So it produced class relations and so on and so forth. But it's interesting that the only question is not either individual or state or ownership, which is based on exploitation. There can be other cases, and renting, of course, we had also very interesting rent strikes in many parts of the world that were producing other forms of rethinking about what it means to live together, because the renters would have to unite in a common cause. So they were describing that they were not separate inhabitants in a complex, but actually a community. So again, we should not rule out the possibility of renting conditions could produce other forms of social organization that will move in the direction of let's say, emancipatory politics.
Thank you. Is there any question? Yes.
Hello.
Hi.
What do you say about the territory on specifically on autonomous neighborhoods?
What? Sorry, could you repeat that?
Sure. Why are you talking about autonomous neighborhoods? What you said about territory creating the boundaries, but the difference they remind me of the distinction between mine, yours, theirs, and the distinction of those spaces with ours.
Mm-hmm.
And to make this distinction, I want to ask a couple of questions. While reclaiming the space, occupying the space as ours, having a relation with the space, keeping a relation with space through its controls, through surveillance without the high authority. The examples you gave are examples of creating housing produced by construction. My question is, not through this production of the space, but not understanding how the design methods for the professionals and also for the occupiers, but as a social framework for occupiers, for example, in the cover of the Venezuela, or occupiers come to public space, private space, also in squat houses. Could we call those also common housing examples of those occupying examples without the and also for the design part, things that aspire architect, I want to ask this. What is the role of the urban professional architect subject in this process? Because this is about rules for organization. We all of them are. So, is it possible to create a conceptual or technical framework for urban or common housing examples for the professionals as well?
Yes. Thank you very much.
I'm not really sure if I understood the first part, but I guess that you are a bit skeptical about reclaiming space through the notion of this space of this is ours in distinction to the space of the others. So this is a kind of potential exclusionary movement. Of course, we need to take into consideration the actual histories of those people and the way they had to form themselves as movements and what exactly forms of confrontation they had to face. So in periods of defense, many of those attempts to create common conditions had to barricade, let's say, themselves, had to, yes, define their place by excluding potential threats. But what I think I have noticed is that they realized that this was a period, not a period of strength, a period of weakness, because the main strength of what they were doing was inviting the society. I've been to various homeless settlements in Brazil, in which the surrounding community, the surrounding, neighborhood, was actually invited by the first group of people, which was in most cases is a numerous group. We're talking about 2,000 to 3,000 people. We're not talking about small endeavors. So they were invited to co-produce this kind of struggle and co-define the scopes of the future steps. So, and what the confronting forces did in many cases was to try to seclude it, to create a sanitary zone around this project in order to avoid the metastasis, to avoid this project becoming a kind of threat through metastasis. So you are right in being skepticist, but they are themselves aware of the danger of doing this, of allowing these projects to become an alternative small paradise. And because they are aware of it, and it's not by chance that most of the initiatives are based on the idea of constructing a kind of alternative form of social organization, which is meant to be expressed as a counterexample, not simply as a declaration, but see, it works, it can happen. We can be equal and we can support each other in everyday conditions without declaring equality in terms of Grand Manifesto. And this is one of the dangers of the squatting movement, because in some cases, especially in Europe, the squatting movement was in a way stopped in the first step, which is establishing a stronghold. And this is a danger, because establishing a stronghold usually or easily can evolve to establishing the idea that we are the avant-garde and others should follow. And from that results the idea that those who are not ready yet are minor, are less than us. And this has created monsters, I'm afraid. Not always, but in most of the cases that's created monsters, because when the time came for them to defend what they were doing, they were alone. So the professionals, I think I mentioned some cases that show the possibilities for professionals, experts concerning the production of space to be part of a process of exchange in which the sharing of skills or the sharing of knowledge can be a first important step. We are, as I was saying to discussion previously, we are, for some, I mean, architects are urban planners. For some reason, we have managed to become educated and acquired certain skills, which are very important for the society. But part of this education is that those skills should be protected as our ownership. So if you common those skills, this is one first step. The second step, equally important, is to appreciate the fact that those people who are meant to establish and produce the right to housing in a very concrete way also carry knowledges, also are inheritors of not only traditions, but actual skills developed in urban living, which is not an easy thing, as you all know. So you have to develop skills, ways of dealing with situations, ways of combining forces with people around you. So the second step is to appreciate the fact that knowledge comes both ways. And of course, the most obvious part, which is the integrating part, is to be in support of those efforts by offering the opportunity of those efforts to visualize, to create images of the possible future, to enrich an imaginary, a collective imaginary, which is in many cases stuck in the predominant consumerist dreams. It's not easy. One of the theorists and practitioners of Usina talks about the devising of a new Imagineers. It's a combination between image and engineer. The new Imagineers, those who can develop images of the future. I mean, whichever way, by creating songs or design plans or whatever, literature. So it's making it possible to see that indeed a different way of life is not simply utopian. It can exist. And in some cases, it has already, elements of it have existed. I mean, I was, last time I was in Ankara, Ankara is in Greek, when I was in Ankara, I went to the museum with the exhibits of what is this site? Anatolia, but the specific site of the Neolithic age, which shows that an egalitarian society existed Çatalhöyük, yeah. It's impressive, and lots of theorists like Edward Soja has talked about it, urban planner theorist. There has been a kind of housing settlement that was integrating the idea of equality and mutual dependence, not only equality, because you need to go around the terraces in order to reach the houses. So that means that the sharing of space is not a declaration. You can have this space, you can be in that space. It's a necessity. It comes from the building of society. So this happened years and years ago. And we think that we are so advanced. I mean, why don't look at these experiments also?
Thank you very much, Professor. Actually, I have some questions and comments related with your last words, but it's said that we have already exceeded our time, and we need to end here for the next session. Maybe we can continue at the outside our discussion. So thank you very much for your participation.
My pleasure.
And also, yeah, and also I would like to express my thanks to our participants. So again, thank you very much.
Thank you.
See you.
Oh.
Yes.
What kind of certificate? All right. Thank you.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
It's with our thanks to you.
Thank
But I will give you.
Yeah, I have a question. Never mind.
Please, yes.
Are you going to take a picture?
Yes.